Friends, welcome to Nehru Memorial Museum and Library this afternoon. Before the proceedings begin, let me just make a few announcements. On the 12th of March, that is tomorrow, the time of course will be the same, 3 p.m. Professor A.R. Wasabi, Senior Fellow, NMML, will speak on 2 emblematic figures. 4, not 2, 4, isn't it? Yeah. 4 emblematic figures in the making of a new India, 1997-2012. Then the day after, 13th March, Professor J. Srinivasan, Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, will speak on how should India deal with climate change. On the 14th, Dr. Ilyas Hussain of Jamia Millia Islamia will speak on Jawaharlal Nehru and the language policy of Republican India. And after that, the same day, that is 14th of March, there will be at 5 p.m. there will be a panel discussion in the auditorium down below, in which Ms. Brinda Grover, Dr. Uma Chakrabarti and Ms. Rosemary Jubechu will discuss gendered violence and the search for justice. You are most welcome to attend these and take part in the discussion. And it's my privilege to be sitting beside Dr. Deepti, Mehrotra. This is the first time I'm meeting her, but when I saw the abstract of her presentation and read about her activities to date, I felt privileged that the Nehru Memorial should have thought of me to be present here to listen to what she has to say. There is so much to be said for the work that she's done. I will not take your time because I have a feeling that some of that will figure in her presentation as well. But here is a remarkable combination of activism, research, and teaching. Not many of us manage to combine all these activities. While theoretically we may talk of the way one impinges upon the other, but here is someone who has done it in real life, both as a practitioner and as a theoretician. So we'll have a flavor of what it is to be in the field, and also to then withdraw and think and reflect and write about all this. She's chosen to speak on a theme of profound significance for our time, that is reinventing non-violence, ideas and ethics. I'm sure all of you who have come so far to listen to her would be as eager as I am to listen to her. Dr. Deepti, Priya, Mehrotra.
Thank you so much, Deepti, and thank you, Mahesh, for inviting me here. Thank all of you for being here. I will try to live up to what this combination of activism and academics and teaching that I have actually indulged in. I hope some quality comes out of it and some insights come out of it. So there will be more questions perhaps than answers coming out of what I will present with you today. Many of us, most of us here as well as elsewhere, I think, want a world that is less violent. Many of us dream of a world that is there beyond violence, dream of having a life beyond violence. Yet we find ourselves participating in violent ways of living, behaving, being. Perhaps the education that we receive, the media that we are subjected to, the history, the sense of history that we grow up with, rationalizes and justifies violence as inevitable, as justified. I quote from a fellow dreamer, J. Krishnamurti. I want to find out, as a human being, how to transcend this violence, how to go beyond it. I see what violence has done to the world, how it has destroyed every form of relationship, how it has brought deep agony in oneself, misery. I see all that. And I say to myself, I want to live a really peaceful life in which there is deep abundance of love. All the violence must go. Now, what have I to do? So we will explore together what perhaps we need to do. Some of these concern ethics because it concerns ideas, it concerns action. I retrace steps back to 1979 when I entered the university, Delhi University. I joined a male college. I am a masculine college perhaps. It had just opened its doors to women, but we were there on the margins. The women were allowed in, but we had no hostels. There were more than 300 men on the campus, students, but no women on the campus. We had no representation in the student union, no common room, no proper common room, no sanitary towels, no place to be sick, no place to rest, and an attitude of boys will be boys. There were chick charts that boys put up, and these were actually rating women on physical assets, more or less. I mean, this whole physical assets is in quotation mark. I was bewildered by this overwhelmingly masculine atmosphere, an unjust kind of an atmosphere, compounded by dull classroom lectures. So there was actually very little that I found to engage my interest in learning, my interest in learning how to live, in learning about my subject. So in a sense, I escaped to spaces where I found that I could learn, I could talk, I could dream, and these initially were feminist spaces. A theatre workshop with Manushi in Miranda House, a play called Om Swaha, where we were doing anti-dowry stories that we actually did within audiences that could be women, men, college students, in courtyards of homes, in the boat club where Karamcharis gathered. There were older men who cried during the performance. There were of course women who were very, very moved. And there were discussions after each performance. So we actually thought we were so involved in this kind of action that we actually were, in a sense, I would say visionaries, but not very practical. We thought we were changing the world actually. We actually believed that by these actions, things would change. But gradually we realized that, moving a few thousand people working at this level is not quite enough to change the world. The world is much larger than that, and the forces of violence, the forces that are generating violence, the structures, the systems are much bigger than that. So this early politicization of protest was also linking across class lines with women's groups working in Bastis. So we came across very early plunged into this kind of activism along with the academics, where when confronted the fact that there are people living in much poorer conditions, who are thinking human beings, who are intelligent human beings, who are also struggling to create a better world for themselves and for others. So whether it's issues of sometimes very poor education, very poor amenities, those actually started moving us and we started getting involved in them. It was also a time when civil liberties groups, democratic rights groups were beginning, were active, were also quite idealistic, extremely idealistic. So back in college in 1981, a big gang of outsiders came in during Holi, and we actually found that although there were very few women present in the college that day, because it was a holiday just before Holi, but there were 2 extra classes. So the few women who were present were actually molested by these outsiders, and they didn't talk about it. There was complete silence. Because I was associated with Manushi already, I investigated, and that's how I got to know what had happened. Because one of the women said that she had actually been knocked onto the ground outside the cafe and dragged, and this was something that the teachers who were on campus, male students who were on campus did nothing about or could do nothing about, or one would say did nothing about really. And the principal who was in his office throughout that half an hour actually disallowed those women who wanted to register an FIR from doing so. So you can understand that these were very shocking incidents for a very young person, and what we did actually within the next year was that we women organized and pooled our anger in a sense, investigated, wrote, mobilized from college to college actually, set up sexual harassment, anti-sexual harassment, vigilance committees. These were unheard of in those days. So in a sense, part of what I'm saying to you is that it's through struggles that even systems begin to change. It doesn't happen on its own. Almost every law that's come in has come in through a struggle by women's groups, or through the laws on whether it's dowry or rape or the political participation. They've come in through women's struggles, and a set of demands that we had. We also got onto the television. It was Doordarshan only at that time. And we went there and said we want to do a program on sexual harassment, and nobody had ever said that on Indian television earlier, it seems. So we were told that, you can do this, but you can't call it sexual harassment. So we couldn't call it sexual harassment because the word sex couldn't be used on Indian television. If you can imagine a time when this was the reality. So they said, can you use the word eve-teasing, which was hugely problematic to us. We were not willing to use a word that trivializes the concern. So we came to some term that was, acceptable to us and to them, perhaps violence against women. And it was the first program on that issue. So that said, I think what we were doing in a sense, and why also I want to add one more thing. We spoke to the Vice Chancellor. We had a set of demands that came up from a number of women's colleges and colleges where women studied. So we also got the police to come in, and women police actually came in and acted as decoys, which worked. It was amazing because we were in a sense redefining what security means to us. We were defining it for ourselves, and we went around to the colonies near the university during Holi and went up to homes where little boys were throwing balloons at strangers, particularly at strange women, and spoke to mothers who were typically the caretakers, and some boys were kind of protected by their mothers. But the point was not to harass the boys. The point was to say that please don't bring up boys who harass women, because the seeds can be sown very early. And there were mothers who were extremely receptive to this. So in a sense, we were moving to name violence for ourselves, to say this is actually something we find violative. It isn't fun for us. It isn't a joke for us. It isn't something we take, it's something we don't want to happen, and we have the right that it not happen. We weren't even using the language of rights, actually at that time, but we were saying that we just don't want this to happen. So there were intense discussions I can remember on strategy in those very early days, where I remember many of the women clarifying that how do we respond to violence? Do we respond to violence in a violent way? And that's very clearly that we do not want to respond to violence violently. So how do we respond to violence? How do we respond to violence? And this is to violence in terms of sexual harassment, violence as sexual assault, violence in relationships also. The more outer political violence or violence out there to which a response could be said to be political, but also violence within homes, within families, relationships. How do we respond? And there are many questions here. In a sense, one can be very congratulatory about it and say celebratory about it. And I think there is something to be celebratory, that women get together, that there is a collective response, that there is a naming and an articulating and a rights-based kind of a resistance to violence. But along with that, I think there are some other questions which perhaps we didn't look at enough, which in a way certainly we didn't look at some of those enough. And these questions are something like this: whether we respond thoughtfully enough, do we respond wholly enough, do we respond non-violently, or do we respond too often in ways that are reactive? Is there self-righteousness? Is there revengefulness? So, these are questions. Our politics, I think, the women's movement politics or politics against violence against women, gender-based violence, has been fairly reflective. But I would say that from the early experience, I would say that we drew the line. We didn't want to look at the other side. We didn't want to look at what made the violators. We didn't want to look at what made the criminals. We didn't want to look at that because we said this is what we can do. We can just try and stop this by organizing, by resisting, by making a voice, by spreading awareness. But the more as I come back to the same issues after 30 years, this question doesn't go away. And I think it's essential for a non-violent response or for a more thoughtful, reflective response to look at the other side and say how much is that an other side? Are these lines that we draw legitimately? Is there really another side out there, which is the side of, I went to Jantar Mantar one of these days, early January, and I heard a speech where somebody was saying, "Ye to hewan hai, hewan." So do we demonize the criminals? Do we demonize those who are the perpetrators? And if we do, how fair is that? So I'm actually getting beyond just only the women's movement to saying this politics against violence, whoever's involved in it. Sometimes perhaps feminists are a little more reflective, but let's not get into that. Perhaps even some feminists are not reflective enough. So, and perhaps there are many different parties in that who haven't even begun thinking of these issues. I think it's important to make a beginning and to say, okay, even those who are not thinking of this, can we reach out and can we discover and invent more creative ways, more creative thinking with more depth, with taking the protest and going beyond those. So I will actually, I have no answers as I keep saying, but I have clues. So I will, in a sense, diversify. There are two stories I want to share with you here. These are stories of ordinary women. They may provide some insight, some clues. These are stories of single mothers. The first is of a woman here called Prachi. She says, when my marriage broke up, I felt shattered. I didn't know how I would survive emotionally, financially, or socially. I knew I could either sink or swim. At that point, a close friend took me along for a Buddhist meditation. I sat there with my eyes shut and heard the guide speak. Heard the guide speak about all the misery in the universe, about orphans starving and dying in Africa. He brought alive a picture of suffering humanity. There was this ocean, and here I was, a drop, a part of the ocean. There were walls around my suffering, so I felt isolated. Suddenly, as I listened, those walls dissolved, and I felt part of the ocean. I was still crying, but not for myself alone. At that moment, I felt I am not cut off from humanity because of my suffering. Rather, I am linked closer. I suppose that's when my healing began. I was a very angry person. I was furious, seething. I needed some way of dealing with the anger rather than carrying it around with me all the time. The meditations were analytical. They appealed to my mind along with my emotions. I learned new patterns. I learned that I could meditate upon the person I'm angry with, who is not a villain perhaps, but rather is another human being with his own needs and shortcomings. That if I love, I can also let go. This is terrible if it's just intellectual, but if it is the whole being, it can be extremely beneficial. So, I think this is one way of an experiential kind of dipping into moment of transformation, where a person has been able to at that moment, and transformation may not be this one-all kind of magic wand that we sometimes imagine it is. I mean, it might be something that is actually a part of a progression. It might not be something that, okay, at this moment this person has attained some kind of enlightenment, but it is a kind of a paradigm shift within the person. It is a move to being able to see beyond oneself, to move out of a kind of self-pity space and to be able to move out of that morass of which is dominated by anger and revengeful and angry and hurtful kind of feelings. So and that's where I find this of interest. And the second story that I want to share is of Nafisa. Nafisa was born in a slum in Hyderabad, married within the same slum, an arranged marriage, to somebody who it turned out drank, was an alcoholic rather, gave no money at home, lived elsewhere, had other affairs going on, and used her whenever he came home quite ruthlessly. So she had 3 daughters over 10 years. Nafisa in those years tried to change him. Initially, she says, with patience and love. She tried also to earn for her children because financially it was quite a mess. He didn't let her do that. He didn't let her move back to her parents because they lived in the same basti, in the same slum. They actually helped support her enough so that she survived at some level. They sent food to her every day, right? They looked after the children every now and then. But if she would move back to her parents, he would come and take one of the children away. So she would move back because she didn't want to have a child living without her in such a terrible situation. So she also tried to get elders to intervene, and they did, but he grew more angry. So 10 years of this, and none of which worked. So one day she says, again I'll quote her own words here. One day she says, there is a dargah just outside our colony. I went and sat there. I thought, I have to go far away from here. There is no other way. I had been planning this for a long time. I had never heard of anybody in my colony leaving to make her own life. But I had seen such things on TV, in a serial or film. I wondered, is it possible? I figured, if one really wants to do it and is willing to take the consequences, then maybe. I had not discussed the idea with anyone, not even my sister. My younger sister would have understood. She often said to me, Appa, only you can tolerate these things. I would have left long ago. So She actually, I won't read out the details, but it's certainly a moving human document of how she leaves, goes to the station with 3 children. The middle one has a muscular problem, so can't walk, and the little one is held by the eldest one. So these are 3 girls aged 11. 11 is the eldest, 2 is the youngest. And they go to Bombay first, then they go to Azalraj there, then they're actually not allowed to be there at night. Then she sits in the train totally without any money, a little bit of money she had up to Bombay. And then she picks up leg up to Delhi because she has heard of Nizamuddin Dargah and that penniless people will be looked after. And she reaches here with no money actually. She was in a burqa at that time. So she at one point sold her watch to buy puris for the children, and she reached, so it's quite a heartwarming story also. She reached and she was in Nizamuddin Dargah. She was there for some time when she kept finding out what she could do, and learnt of Shakti Shalini, a shelter home that was there right in Dakshinpuri, and was there for some time and kept finding out whether she could get some work. And she got work in another NGO called Action India right in Jampura. And to date she's there. She's in the Barsati. She works in the NGO. She cleans, she cooks, she looks after the place, works in another 2 places nearby. And a little bit more about what she says now. She says, I'm fine here. I have found the sort of atmosphere I wanted. This place is good for my children. They are doing well. Amina always comes first in her class. Razia is learning to write. Most of my salary goes into their education. That is my priority. I have one goal in life now, to educate my children and give them courage to stand on their own feet. Once they have studied, they will be capable of looking after themselves. She, when asked to talk about herself and her future, she says, I will be on my own at some point, and I will go back perhaps to my brothers, sisters, family, because all of them have been supportive to her struggle. And she says, I had suffered so much. The courage developed inside me on its own. It was born of intense suffering. If one suffers, something hardens inside like a rock. It is as strong as a rock, this courage of mine. I decided I would change my life, come what may. This I have done. Wow. Really, Nafisa is the first story in this book of single mothers, and this story, when I researched and wrote this book on single mothers called Home Truths, this story was really so inspiring for me that it is definitely the first story, and will always continue to be a very, very inspiring story. So I think why I have said this is clear enough, because these are very ordinary kind of women with very ordinary human beings, taking small steps, but taking steps that are very big in the kind of transformatory potential, the kind of transformatory actualization. And these, I think we need to look more closer, pay more attention to, build more upon. I think we need to move attention away sometimes from the violators and the violence towards creating new mindsets and new ways of life and being. And then also coming back to those violators and being able to say that can we do something out there as well. These indicate moves beyond anger, transmuting anger into creative energy and creative action. And they signify a renewal of life and reaffirming of love. What of our responses to violence out there? So, I'm coming to violence that is communal violence, violence that is unleashed by modern day development, violence which is ruthless, violence which is often by the state, violence that is destructive of the environment, of nature, of knowledge systems. we're all involved in this. We're all looking at these issues day in and day out. So riots, industrial disasters, medical science which violates our bodies and minds. Violence lurks in so many forms, in so many spaces. Our politics and our ethics is tested at many points. So how do we actually move towards empathetic and deeply insightful practices where we are able to be effective, to strategize effectively, to actually begin thinking, or to continue those who are thinking, to continue thinking in ways that will not be purely revengeful, will not be purely anti, will not be purely saying that these are our demands. I think all that is extremely important, but going with that, along with that, beyond that also. And taking into our stride all these kinds of areas, all but forgotten areas, the midwives, the knowledge in the hands of healers. We have these amidst us today. The Adivasis who still practice ways of being with no glorification at all, but absolutely cool-headedly, ways that are very close to nature, which are organically connected to ways of life and to nature, which many of us have lost out on, which are very valuable, and which are daily being destroyed, which are minute by minute being destroyed. So the farmers, the craftspeople, the kind of state-led development, the kind of capitalist development that we have today is destroying and is actually delegitimizing. The destruction works at many levels. It works at the level of hegemony, just saying that all this is valueless. The midwives have nothing valuable in their practice. And many of us have started believing that the midwives had nothing valuable in their practice. But anybody who has actually bothered to look into a concern of what the agriculturalists have been saying, what the craftspeople have been saying, what the midwives have been saying, the practices in their hands, anybody who has bothered to look at, to research, go deeply into, to work along with, to listen to actively listen to any of these people and their values, their knowledge systems, will vouchsafe that there is so much valuable out there that we are actually complicitous actually in having it rejected, having it overlooked, destroyed. And I think this is at our own cost. It's at the cost of people who are typically living in poverty, who are increasingly impoverished, who are increasingly pauperized, who are displaced in many different ways from their resource base, from where they're living, from their professions, and who are therefore, of course, obviously the worst sufferers, but all of us suffer. If something like, to stay with the image of midwifery or the example of midwifery, our grandmothers, great-grandmothers were able to give birth in very different ways. Childbirth happened in very different ways. We are losing that historical memory also because we've begun to believe that there was nothing valuable in that. But when you look at the research, when you listen to the midwives, when you see the best midwives practice, you realize that there is something so very valuable out here, and these are hard, they're practices. They're actual practices. For instance, the woman's body is not at all cut during childbirth in the midwife's way. There is this is routine so cesareans happen to many women, but there is a routine procedure called episiotomy. And episiotomy is routine. The medical doctor cannot, the gynecologist obstetrician, cannot deliver a baby without episiotomy. This is a cut, a perineal cut. This does not have to happen. But there are practices in which this does not happen. So we have actually, what this example is really to say, that we are rejecting ways of knowledge and practice which are actually far more non-violent, which are actually far less violative of the body, of our bodily integrity, of our being, of our emotions. And we are actually moving thoughtlessly, in a sense, to ways of being that are far more violated. And this is happening over our, in a sense, it's happening despite us being rational beings and rational we think it's a very reasonable, reasoned world that we're moving into, moving beyond the emotional, beyond the superstitious, into a realm which is much more scientific and reasonable. But this realm has actually not researched, not studied what it is rejecting. This scientific, so-called scientific realm has not bothered to really study what it is rejecting. It is more a play of power. It is much more a play of power. So there is no research that is there which really conclusively looks at what are the midwise ways from a scientific point of view, why are they being rejected, why are they being denied. So this is, I think, consigned to the trash heap. And we need to look at what all do we defend against. Our organizing, our research, our agitation is for the right causes. Does it go deep enough? So there are the Chipko activists, there are the Narmada Bachao Andolan activists taking up Jal Satyagraha against a development that is dishonest, ruthless. And I think some of the questions I'm left with are, who are the violators? What is our relationship to them, to the violators? Are we justified in externalizing, in being self-righteous, in our rage against the perpetrators? So long as we participate actively or partially actively, or are apathetic to, and so long as we benefit from violent systems and structures, we do support those structures, we do support their happening. Through our consumerism, perhaps through our greed, through our apathy, we allow poverty, we allow degradation and systematic brutalization within the same society, within our midst. So we are, to put it in a nutshell, we are producing rapists, and we're part of this whole system. So the violators are not so easy to identify. They're not so distinct or so self-contained. If we were to look at Gandhi for a moment, the state is an organ of violence, he would say, but to get rid of it, the masses of people have to imbibe truth and non-violence. So if the masses were to, say, strike for clean air, for fresh water, for reasonable, dignified kinds of respect to their knowledge systems, for work, it would knock the bottom out of the political and economic systems. But who is going to actually, who is going to lead this resistance? Who is going to organize the masses? And actually there's nobody probably at present. So I think we come back to, I want to look at one person, and because this is one person I find is doing more than I can see anybody else, in a sense, doing in this realm. And this is Erom Sharmila, because her determined action, it is being called partly, some people say it's inaction. Why is she just locked up there in prison and not actively leading any struggle here? But I would argue that this is actually the most effective action that anybody has taken which has drawn attention to the violence in Manipur, in the northeast. It is the most effective action that has actually drawn solidarity. It is a principled stand which appeals to hearts and minds. It is, if we look at it in terms of placing it, the idea, what is she doing? There is, a huge literature on non-violence, and we're just going to, we're not even entering it in a way, we're just, or just about entering the literature. If you look at Gene Sharp, one of the most educative writers on non-violence today, he has isolated 198 methods of strategic non-violence. 198 methods of strategic non-violence. And strategic non-violence is distinct from philosophical non-violence. So strategic non-violence is when non-violence is used as a strategy, ready to achieve particular ends, political ends, public ends. So fasting is one of the 198 methods of strategic non-violence. And the others are very much within the realm of familiarity. They're appeals, petitions, education also, constructive work as well. So this is very, very Gandhian, and Sharp recognizes the debt to Gandhi. In fact, the entire realm of conflict transformation and peace studies today bears a great debt to Gandhian thinking. So, and these are huge disciplines and very important disciplines, growing disciplines with a real need in the world for them. So now the language of non-violence that perhaps Iram Sharmila is partly embodying, we could ask whether this is strategic only or is it philosophical non-violence. Philosophical non-violence is a person who's using the methods but is using them with an added additional inner dimension, which is to say that the person is also looking into one's own daily actions and looking into one's own daily thoughts and feelings. As we all know that Gandhi was trying to do. I mean, the amount that the man wrote and the amount that he wrote about himself and his daily thoughts and actions is just actually astounding. And it's very self-revelatory, and you can see the kind of moves that a human being has tried to make. He also, of course, said very late in his life that I'm a very poor specimen of satyagraha. So Gandhi did say that he's a very poor specimen of satyagraha, which is to say that this is a very, very exacting discipline. But it is possible to be in it without having achieved perfection in it. So I think what is relevant for me, for us perhaps, is that it is possible to look beyond, it is possible to envision, it is possible to reimagine, it is possible to say that, okay, if I feel all the self-righteousness and rage at the persons who are violating, at the perpetrators, I can try and move beyond that. I can look at that and say that, is this the place I want to stay at? Can I move with this anger, beyond this anger, to transmute this anger? Can I move towards a whole range of kind of very interesting ideas? Can I move towards fearlessness, abhay? Can I move towards something like asangraha? These were kind of the inner dimension of ahimsa, or the part of the whole move towards training to be non-violent, or move towards then a non-violent social order, which persons who are non-violent are the only ones equipped in a sense to bring about. So this is to say that it is possible to be in that stream without claiming that one is so great, without claiming a great self-righteousness about it, without saying that I am actually far ahead of everybody else, but that the struggle in itself, or that awareness itself, the looking at it. And Krishnamurti would actually say that if you look enough, if you really just look at how violent, if I look at how violent I am and what it means for the world, I am the world, you are the world is not distinct from me, it flows in and out, me and the world are not distinct. And if I can actually look closely enough at my own anger, my own greed, my own kind of all kinds of prides and arrogance and ambition and lust for power and all kinds of these things which I do have. If I can look at that enough and see the kind of violence that is generated in the world due to this kind of inner life within us, then there would be essentially there would be a transformation. There would essentially, there's no way that one could live. It's like it says that if you see fire, if you see how dangerous it is, so you move away from it. So if you see how dangerous it is to be this violent person, you would instantly move away from it. So I think this is very, 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 in a sense, profound, and it points towards an ethics where there is a linking of politics, transformative politics, with a deep kind of ethical being. I haven't used the word spiritual so far, and perhaps we can do without it, but it is there, this dimension, and of course each of these words can be unpacked and unraveled and is hugely problematic in different ways. So we could talk about that, but I think it's spirituality which is somewhere very, very linked to practical change. It's very grounded. It's grounded in action, and it relates to universal kind of this universal is hugely problematic also, but to a kind of underlying awareness of some common humanity, an underlying awareness of some perfectibility or some progressive perfectibility within each human being. So, and which is actually close to the concept of truth or satya, and which is close to that concept of so if there can be, I would say, this kind of spiritual awareness, and often very, 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 very ordinary people. I've interacted more and researched much more with ordinary women than with ordinary men, but so I can claim to say that many ordinary women actually are close to this kind of feeling. It is a feeling of actually working with suffering and love, but I don't think that always translates into politics. I think somewhere it gets lost in having things like very low self-esteem, very low kind of collective ability, very low ability to confidence to link up one's own convictions with the political world out there. So it is this realm of ethics where there is a profound kind of awareness that I am not the final word and my politics needs to keep growing. That may lead, I feel very strongly, that may lead to something, to a politics where we could actually make an effective kind of a change, and there has to be an inner and an outer dimension to this. So I could end right here, or I could read out a little bit from a little bit on Irom Sharmila. So what would you say in terms of time? Yeah, we have time. So this is the last part of the very last pages in a book on Irom Sharmila. One April evening in Imphal in 2008, like Harauba, the sacred dance, is approaching its final hour. A dancer announces that nobody should leave in between the movements that are to follow. A person can either leave immediately or else afterwards. Rhythmic music accompanies the movement. The sonorous beating of drums, the haunting notes of a flute. A Maidi is a priestess, drives evil spirits away from the stage, using her double-edged knife for protection. The Maidis make serpentine movements, gracefully weaving their way in intricate patterns. One wrong step can mean cosmic imbalance. The serpentine movement symbolized Pakhangwa, the dragon-headed divine serpent protector of the external world, the public sphere. The dancers trace the path of the serpent's coil, a mystical labyrinth. These movements are designed to protect all those present from harmful influences for another year. Human action, when in consonance with the divine, keeps the world in balance. The dance requires total concentration from the dancers and the viewers. Anyone leaving in the middle of the dance would break the magic. It would bring catastrophe into human affairs. In a way, Irom Sharmila's past is like a dance, which began years ago. She is imprisoned, physically isolated and force-fed, and yet we can imagine her engaged in the slow, sure movements of a dance, a salutation to divine forces. She will not leave midway. It is as if she is deep within a labyrinth, weaving her way in measured steps. It is an exacting dance, testing the limits of human endurance. It is an inspired dance, led by the vision of a radically changed world. The rest of us, co-dancers or viewers, are vitally important too. In just the viewing, we have become witnesses, part of a totality we barely comprehend. We too cannot abandon the dance midway. We cannot leave. Not yet. Nobody knows when it will end or where. The end is not in Iram Sharmila's hands. In her hands is only the intention, the discipline, and the art. To this she is dedicated. Her moves are creating their own rhythm, ushering a certain order into the world, perhaps. Like her, we too have begun listening to a different music, powerful resonance. Through her dance, she hopes to make a difference to the human world, bring it into closer harmony with the divine order. The manifest world is in immense disorder, but the process of making peace is also going on invisibly. We sense it sometimes, in silence and in solitude, in the collective aspiration of a spiritual gathering, or in the marvelous unity of a people's movement. When the change manifests, the violence will abate. She would take the final step, retreat backstage to rest a while. People would order fruits and sweets to the divine forces in reverence and gratitude. The Maidis will distribute these to each person present. Sharmila too will savor the taste. A poem by her called The Fragrance of Peace, and I end with this. When life comes to its end, please transport my lifeless body, place it on the soil of Father Kogru, a mountain in Manipur. The outer cover of my body is sure to dry out. Let it rot under the ground. Let it be of some use to future generations. Let it transform into ore in the mind. I will spread the fragrance of peace from Kangle, Manipur, my birthplace. In the ages to come, it will spread all over the world. So I think this is a politics of hope, a politics of principled defense without thought for one's own suffering, even thought for one's own freedom. And while I don't think that, I don't know anybody else who can approximate this. I certainly can't. I've been very close to thinking about this. It's a kind of strength which is beyond what I think I'm capable of just now. But that a human being can be doing this, I think means that human beings can do something so powerful. And one human being, I think there was this Gandhian quote which most of us know, that one human being who can express the power of the force of non-violence in life can actually exercises a force that is greater than all the forces of brutality. So this is the kind of hope that each of our small actions may have, and in solidarity we can try and build those further.